Hello everyone and welcome to another slideshow here on my channel. I'm Cody and the month of June's going to be a little light even though it doesn't feel like it. You'll still get 2 slideshows, this included, a little bit more informal, and then an extra video I just wanted to do for fun. But someone had commented on one of my polls recently, and or maybe it was a video, one of the two, I think it was a video actually, talking about the F-5 and its viability and how it kind of uniquely fits Ukraine. And I've heard this before, and this is a video I've toyed around with making for a couple months now, but I wanted to figure out how to frame it, and that has changed a lot. So we'll kind of get into it, but as we kind of go through here, I want to represent a couple of different things. So one, the context of the F-5 in Ukraine. Does it work? It has the operational ability to work off of roadways. It's fairly low maintenance by comparison to things like the F-16, and people keep talking about it. I particularly made this slide right after a Ward Carroll stream where people had kept bringing it up. So this idea has been around for a while, pretty much since maybe the start of the war, roughly. Not only would this work not only would we talk about it in the context of Ukraine, but also smaller regional conflicts. And then I want to round things out with talking about the viability and the value of manned fighter aircraft versus air defense and drones for smaller countries or countries that don't have a large military budget. So what am I going to cover? Well, we're going to cover the combat record of the F-5 in particular. We'll take a look at the specs of the F-5 and the ill-fated F-20, why these planes in particular keep being brought up in this context, some modernized examples, because there are still modern F-5s flying around today, taking a look at some ground-up modernization efforts that could feasibly make it viable, and then my personal thoughts rounding out that idea of manned combat craft versus air defense and drones. So, the elephant in the room. The combat record of the F-5 is not stellar. It is a cool, sleek-looking aircraft, but it's also not been super effective, but it also has been used in a varying degree of ways, right? We still use them in aggressor squadrons, so that is still something that exists. There are private companies that have modernized these. There are air forces that still fly them. But overall combat record, the U.S. has not had, the worst go of it in the Vietnam War with losing 1 to ground fire. These stats come from MiGFlug. I'll have the credits at the end. So I'm not 100% sure on how accurate these are and how particular these definitions are, but generally, this gives us a consensus to work from. You have the Ogden War in Ethiopia with 7 air-to-air kills, 0 losses, and 2 lost to ground fire. Probably the best performance. You have Iran using them in the Iran-Iraq War, which is about a decade long in the 80s. 18 air-to-air kills, 23 losses, 23 to ground fire, or 12 to ground fire. These were left over from the U.S. being supplying the previous regime there in Iran before the revolution happened. So they would rock F-4s, F-5s, F-14s, things like that. The Western Saharan War, Morocco lost 14 to ground fire, and then the Gulf War, Saudi Arabia lost 1 to ground fire. So it's not great, but it is designed for a very specific role, and it's something the Ukrainians might be able to still use. Now, I still think that something like the F-18 has, the Legacy Hornets, have much better survivability and viability than the F-5, but the F-5 is significantly cheaper. But like I said, we'll talk about the idea towards the end of the video, but yeah. So what are the kind of base specs of the F-5, the Tiger II? So this is generally what you're rocking. Empty weight just under 10,000 pounds, gross weight just a little bit under 16,000 pounds, so not quite doubling it there. Max takeoff weight does go that much further, though, to just under 25,000 pounds. But it's a light aircraft. It's really not designed to carry a ton of stuff necessarily. So its max speed, Mach 1.63 or 1,082 miles per hour, with its maximum cruise speed being just under Mach 1. So it is small, it is light, it is fairly fast, especially for its era, considering this is an aircraft of the 60s. It's not going to be, popping out Mach 2. It's not an F-15, but it is still, for its size, for its mission profile, pretty capable. Its combat radius is about 140 miles. That being said, obviously that can be augmented with external fuel tanks, and then different modernization upgrade packages have changed that a little as well. Service ceiling just under 52,000 feet. Service ceiling with one engine, 41,000 feet. Wing loading, 133 pounds per square foot. Its thrust-to-weight ratio is 0.4. Not great, but thrust-to-weight ratio is not everything either. And it rocks two General Electric J85 GE21 afterburning turbojet engines, with each providing 35,000 pounds of dry thrust and 5,000 pounds with afterburner. Then you have the F20, which is the kind of upgraded version that was kind of a competitor in the 80s and 90s to the F-16, and it kind of being modernized as well. So a little bit heavier. Its empty weight is just under 12,000 pounds, gross weight just above 16,000 pounds, and its max takeoff weight about 27,500 pounds. Its maximum speed is Mach 2 at 1,320 miles per hour. Combat radius of 630 miles. Once again, this never went into full production, so we don't really know. That's kind of an estimated value. But once again, that's probably going to be considering external fuel tanks, things of that nature. Service ceiling, 56,000 feet. It is a single-engine aircraft. It's not like the previous F-5. Its thrust-to-weight ratio is 1.1, with one General Electric F404 GE100 afterburning turbofan engine with 11,000 pounds of dry thrust or 17,000 pounds with afterburner. So it is a pretty quick little aircraft. It never went into production. A lot of people do kind of speculate on how much more effective or how effective in general it would have been by comparison to the F-16, Block 50, 52, CD, stuff like that. And yeah, we don't really know. But this thing has kind of been in the shadows of the airplane community for years at this point. And it just every couple of years resurges for some reason. So why the F-5 and the F-20? Well, it kind of goes back to the core design of the idea that it's a cheap, light, easy to maintain fighter. That was the whole kind of core concept that brought the F-5 to prominence as a cheap exportable fighter for countries that the U.S. allied with but didn't want to give them expensive aircraft, or that country couldn't afford those aircraft. So it's fairly inexpensive. It's very simple in terms of its parts and maintenance routines. It's lightweight, as we saw by comparison to pretty much everything else. It's pretty small, very lightweight. It's not designed for loitering. It's not designed for long missions. And it can operate off of roadways or really short runways. So if you've been following things in Ukraine, you know that's actually kind of right up their alley for the most part. However, there are drawbacks, as we saw with the combat record. This is not designed to be your premier fighter. This is short-range air interdiction. This is maybe some light air combat air patrol, but generally speaking, this is not your air superiority fighter. It's not an ground attack aircraft. It is very specific in its role, and when you use it outside of that, it doesn't tend to do super well. But there are a couple of air forces that still or have recently used F-5s and have modernized them. So we see the F-5TH over there on the right-hand side. That is, I believe, Thailand's version, if I remember correctly. And yeah, it's got data link. It's got a more modern radar. I think this one might be an X-band or like a really small AESA radar. But I think it's the X-band one. I think it's an Italian radar. It can use the lightning pod, so it has the combat camera stuff. It has jamming capability to an extent. You have your display in your helmet. You have a more modernized cockpit with some digital displays. It looks kind of like an F-18 Legacy Hornet display. And then you have more modernized missiles that give you beyond visual range capability. Now you'll notice I started with this, not only because the picture is bigger, but because it's technically the most modern variant in active service and combat still, or in service to potentially be in combat. The F-5 AT is actually developed by a private company that works a lot with the U.S. aggressor squadrons and has upgraded a couple of F-5s they have to have a IR sensor, basically an Iris-T pod developed by, or an Iris-T sensor built into the nose cone, just below the canopy, developed by Lockheed Martin. So it does give you kind of that capability of, to an extent, combating stealth aircraft and other things that you may need that kind of a sensor for, as well as having full digital displays, full touchscreen. It's really modernizing the interface, the sensor suite, but it's not necessarily a combat aircraft. You have the F-5EM, which I believe is the Brazilian version. They've taken steps to modernize their fleet as well, but I don't remember specifically if it goes as far as the F-5TH. And then you have the F-5S, which was Singapore's version of their modernization package. More modern radar, which I don't remember specifically if it is an AESA radar, because they retired these in 2016. So I think it's just a more modern radar, but not quite the newer, hotter AESA radars. I'm going to have the capability of firing not only beyond visual range BVR missiles, but also like the AMRAAM, but also the AIM-9X as well. So you have these modern combat capabilities, but what if you took it a step further? Because there's no active production lines for the F-5 or the F-20. What if you took it to a production line, say, in Iran? As we saw with the combat records, Iran has F-5s. They've had them since they purchased them from the U.S., and since they got cut off from a lot of parts, they had to cannibalize a lot of their existing F-5s or F-38s, or T-38, sorry, or F-14s or F-4s to keep their fleet running, right? Because they didn't really have an advanced aerospace industry back in that time frame. And they really don't still. They do, they've made progress, but it's not anywhere near like anyone else for the most part. But as you see here, they have a couple of different, like, very small batch one-offs of different variants of the F-5. You kind of see the bulkier one there with the split fins on the back there. Then you have pretty much traditional-looking F-5s with a couple of different modernization packages. But this got me into thinking of the concept of, if you're starting from the ground up, with a full, say, production line in America or in Europe somewhere, or even, in Ukraine, eventually maybe, why not take that extra step and reshape it, right? This is something, there's a lot of more changes, obviously, between the Legacy Hornet and the Super Hornet, but one of them was reshaping the Super Hornet to reduce its radar cross-section, and that's something you could carry over to the F-5 or the F-20, depending on which variant you wanted to go with. You extend the intake to kind of provide more of like an S-shape there. This is something the F-18 uses, the F-35 uses, to hide the actual fans, because that is a, just straight kind of nearly vertical thing that radar is going to hit and bounce back from. So if you can hide that a little bit more, you're reducing already a fairly small radar cross-section, and then you can kind of, I don't want to say angle, but make the design more angular overall. Extend the leading edge that goes under the intake. I've seen some people redesign it where they move the wings up and have the intake under, much like the Legacy and Super Hornets. I don't necessarily, I'm not an engineer of any sort, so, feel free to take your shots at me here, but I feel like kind of keeping to this maybe makes it a little bit easier. I have no idea why, but it keeps more of the silhouette, and I kind of like the silhouette. So, but if you do keep it there, having that leading edge on the bottom is kinematically going to make whatever version of this a little bit more similar to that of the MiG-29 Su-27s. And I'm not going to say it's going to make that transition easy, but it does help this aircraft operate somewhat more similar to what they're used to. Now, outside of that, angling it up a little bit and then splitting that tail fin there, doing too much like we saw with the Iranian version, or one of them, much like, once again, the Legacy and Super Hornet. So, of course, you could upgrade the avionics. We've seen a lot of different countries, or the countries that still operate it, do that. Updating the cockpit display, adding additional sensors or systems like the IR sensor that the F-5 AT has, doing a new engine, and this is something that actually just dawned on me as I was kind of thinking about recording this video. I was thinking if you go F20 or a modernized F-5 with a single engine, which is just the F20, upgrading it obviously to the Super Hornet engine, because the F20 was designed around the Legacy Hornet engine. So the F414 GE400, but what if you, say, pitch this to Ukraine? Say Ukraine decides, hey, we need a small light fighter that's inexpensive, it's cheap to maintain, whatever. What if you just use legacy Soviet engines? Like, sure, it's not going to last very long, but that's really not the intent of these, right? And I don't mean from a survivability perspective, but, you wouldn't see a country really holding on to these unless they don't have any other options. So that's something that's viable. That's something that we could probably work around. If we've been able to stick pretty much every type of NATO missile on a MiG-29 at this point, I'm pretty sure we can figure something out like this. It's more complicated, but still. If we're designing from the ground up, that's something you can build in for. You can add some conformal fuel tanks, especially with kind of lengthening that in tank on top. You can kind of add a little bit of a conformal design on top of it, or below it somehow. Not really sure exactly how, once again, not an engineer, but that could help extend its range because Ukraine's a pretty big country. And then you could kind of go the route that was somewhat pitched with the Block 3 Super Hornets, with a weapon storage device that is going to reduce the radar cross-section even more if you wanted to keep it a relatively short range air interdiction platform that the Russians would have a lot more difficulty trying to pick up. But let me know if you guys have ever thought of this and what changes you would make to a modernized F-5 or F-20, because I've seen a couple of different concepts out there, and they're all pretty different. So now my personal thoughts. Would upgrading the F-5 and the F-20 really matter? Is it still going to have roughly the same combat record? And unfortunately, I think it would. Even with upgrading a lot of it, if you're looking at it in the context of Ukraine or smaller air forces that need a cheap aircraft, it's probably going to handle a lot more mission sets that it's designed for, and it's probably going to see very similar losses to what we've seen previously. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a terrible idea, but I don't think it's going to be nearly what a lot of people think when they think the F-5 operating off of roadways. If your idea of, or your ideal aircraft for Ukraine is, hey, can it operate off of a roadway? They have a lot of those. You're going to be pretty sorely disappointed by how a lot of those things will fare. Like, even my idea, or not my idea, but one that I've been pretty supportive of like the Legacy Hornets. I understand those are aged aircraft that are only designed as like a stopgap and probably have a much better chance than the F-5, but also you would see equipment losses. That's something you're going to see with any of these Western systems. Conveniently, around the time of the recording of this, one of the Patriot batteries in Ukraine was slightly damaged by a Russian attack, and some people have been really unsure. A lot of people have been taken by surprise. And this is something I've said before. Western equipment's going to get lost. It's just unfortunate. And of course, the Patriot batteries are one of the higher ticket items on that. But regardless, you're going to see Leopard 2s destroyed. You may see some Chieftains receive some significant damage. You may see Abrams. You may see Bradleys. That's just kind of how war works. And that leads me to the idea that a lot of smaller countries would probably be a little bit more beneficial to is, would an IADS or manpad system be a better investment than manned fighter craft, right? This is something that you see a lot of smaller wars in Africa feature very limited numbers of aircraft. The Armenian-Azerbaijan wars have pretty much done the same thing. Very limited numbers of manned aircraft. So if you just, have a small fleet of, say, drones or something, or small manned aircraft or helicopters, and your opponent has roughly the same, if you can kind of keep the skies relatively closed, that's a pretty good idea, and it's usually a cheaper alternative than having a large air force. Now that kind of brings us to drones, right? Because something like the TB2 did a lot of work in the Armenian-Azerbaijan war and has done very well for Ukraine. So if you have this between $2 and $10 million variant of the TB2, which I think it generally hovers in like the $4 to $5 million range, but I'm not 100% sure on that, is much cheaper than like most American alternatives. But you can have a small fleet of those, and it kind of operates as your Overwatch in a way. Like, it can do surveillance, it can do, to an extent, some ground attack capabilities. But would this overall be a cheaper combination? IADs, or mostly man-pads, depending on your situation, and a small fleet of drones, or a lot of commercial drones, or something. And that's, of course, not to say that these ideas invalidate air forces, right? But smaller countries that can't field a large air force or a flushed out air force, this might be a better return on investment, better value per their currency than having an air force, even with something cheaper like the F-5 or F-20. And that leads me to kind of the next step of, if you've kind of closed the skies, is longer range artillery a better investment in that? Because you're still going to need the ability to hit enemy targets further and further away. And if you don't have aircraft to do that, or your drones are being intercepted or whatever, you may need rocket artillery. So you combine all of these three things and you still have a much cheaper ticket price, most likely, than a more elaborate flushed out air force. Because, F5s or F20s, or hell, even F16s themselves are not an air force, right? They are not the problem solvers that I think a lot of people really think they are. And, that is just kind of what it is. But, I think that it doesn't kill the idea of having an air force. Because most big countries or wealthy countries, that's a very viable option and it's much more effective. But there's a lot of smaller countries that have these regional conflicts somewhat more regularly that can't afford that, and this may be a better alternative. So this is not, is the aircraft, the fighter jet dead? Is the tank dead? No. This is just, some countries may benefit more from a system like this than otherwise. And of course, my credits here, wikis, of course, for basic information, MIGFlug for those combat data points. And as far as YouTube channels for aviation, military aviation, stuff like that, Ward Carroll, whenever he talks to Justin Bronx, it's always really interesting, but Ward Carroll's YouTube channel is great. Pilot Photog, military aviation history. Annie Markey history does some interesting stuff with fighter stuff. Falcons Fighter Tales, and of course the Fighter Pilot Podcast. So if you like aircraft, go check those people out. They're all phenomenal channels, do great work. And let me know down below what you think of an F-5 being modernized.